be fun to show you Photoshop's interface, like what it looks like, just in case you've never been in it before and would maybe want to try it, but then to also show you like how similar Pixlr like truly is to Photoshop and some of the things you can do. So just to kind of start, let's see, over here on the right hand side, we have like what's called the layers palette. So that's very similar to like the whole idea of layers in Pixlr, which I'll show you as well. You can see I have just like my one photo. I wonder if, no, I can't zoom in. I have my one photo here. It's locked. There's an eye, meaning I can see it. If I click this eye, well, nothing's going to happen because this is locked. But if I unlock this, I can toggle this eye on and off. And when there's nothing underneath, it shows up as this like checkered background, which actually kind of hurts my eyes, to be honest, if I look at it. So we'll get rid of that. So that's kind of the layers palette. There's things you can do over here, like changing how it's blended, opacity. You can add a new layer, like if you want to, you know, put something underneath or on top. So kind of very similar in that sense. And then I just kind of wanted to show you what the curves, because we talked about when we're adjusting levels. We talked about levels and curves before, and if you're new and you haven't heard me talk about levels and curves, that's the first thing I do when I look at a photograph. Because when we take a photograph initially, whether it's from our phone, a point and shoot camera, a DSLR camera, whether we're choosing the settings ourselves or whether they're auto settings, we're taking an exposure. So the light is working with the subject and working with our camera lens for how long it's open, right? And we're creating an exposure. So when we first look at that exposure, we have a range of lights, mediums, and darks. So when I first pull up a picture, sometimes it might be a little too dark, it might be a little too light. So that's why I start there and I check those things. So I go to image adjustments and you can do levels or curves. And I'm gonna hop into Pixlr in just a minute. I just wanna show you what it looks like in Photoshop a minute. Oops. Helps if I have the right image selected. You've got to be on the right layer. Okay, so here I'm going to image adjustments and I've got my levels. Okay, so I'm going to show, so take a look at this screen and I'll show you what it looks like in Pixlr. Now it's much more advanced here in Photoshop. But basically what we're looking at on this screen is we have information from our photograph that we took. So down here at the bottom, you'll notice it ranges from black, then goes to dark gray, medium gray, light gray to white, okay? That's the information, meaning the lights, the mediums, and darks in our photograph. So this side is gonna be my darks, this side is my light, this is my medium. So now, I've mentioned this before if you've been in my classes where, you know, I have worked on my photography skills, and when I take a manual photograph, I work on my settings before I shoot the picture. And that reads here in this information. I can see that that's true. So for example, when I see this arrow and this arrow, my information should start to rise like the mountain, okay? So I'm gonna show you an example of a photograph where it doesn't do that. Let's open up another photograph real quick and I will show you one that doesn't look like that. Let's see, sample photographs, this one. So I did not take this photo. This is just from unsplash.com, but you may notice how it kind of has a darker overall tone to it. So when I go to image adjustments levels, now look at that information. That looks a lot different than the photo I showed you that I took. So what's happening here is the darks and the lights, it's flat, 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 flat. Then it starts to rise. Same on the dark side, just not as long. flat, 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 then it rises. Whereas again, if you look at my photograph, my dark and my light is right where it starts to rise. That's because when I took this photo, I checked my exposure, I was paying attention to my camera settings, and I shot it to be correct exposure, so I wouldn't have to do much editing. So that piece comes from the camera, but sometimes that doesn't always happen. So I'm just gonna pop back over here and just show you really quick what happens when I move this, these sliders now. So if I take my dark slider and move it to the right where it starts to hit this information, notice what happens. Okay, so this was before, kind of flat, kind of gray, not a lot of contrast or depth. The darks aren't super dark here. But if I pull the slider to the information as it starts to rise, my darks pop, okay? And they're giving me more sense of depth because those darks are going back in space. Now I can make the same thing happen with my lights. If I slide this toward the information, notice how that now pops. Okay, now I've got this nice sense of light to medium to dark because we need all of those components to create depth in a photo. Now, certainly sometimes there's photographers that want their photo to be sort of grayed out or to have a certain look or aesthetic to it, which totally, that's fine. There's a time and place for that. But this is like the first thing I really do. So just to kind of show you that, the other thing I thought I would just show you really quickly in Photoshop, just because it's fun. It's a fun thing that Photoshop offers. So Photoshop has filters. And you can, so I've installed, you can buy external filters essentially to ramp up your Photoshop experience. So I bought one from a company, they're called Totally Rad, and their extension is called Rad Lab. So I'll just kind of show you this a minute just because it's kind of fun. But Rad Lab is this neat extension to Photoshop where it has all these little presets. So as I scroll through, I can build recipes essentially and do different things. And you can see the preview. So let's say I want to warm up this photo. I want to create a fall kind of warmth. This is a warm filter. So you can see there's when I put the filter on, there's off, on, off. So Photoshop offers these fun little plugins to customize, and you can save and build recipes so that you can, like, say you take a whole batch of photos of, you know, your daughter, you know, a fall photo shoot or something, and you took a whole bunch of her and you want them to all have the same look. Well, you can like click the button and apply them to all of them, sort of a thing. So it's a kind of a neat thing you can do. But yeah, you can customize and build as much of these as you want. There's even things like blurring the edges. So there's not blurred, there's blurred. So there's little fun things you can do to just kind of punch it up. So, and again, just kind of a neat little thing I thought I'd show you. I didn't know that about Photoshop for a long time, that you could do things like that. And that's just a tidbit of it. There's a lot of extensions and things you can add to Photoshop. So if you ever have Photoshop questions or you want to know about it, you want to know if it's worth it, you know, feel free to email me on that as well. But I'm going to stop sharing my Photoshop screen a minute so I can share my Pixlr screen with you, which is the main event, of course. I think now that, and depending if you've seen Photoshop before, I think it's neat seeing how the interface has those similarities. Okay, let's see. Okay, so here is Pixlr again. Hey, Joanne, how are you?
Good. Thanks for letting me in.
Of course. Yeah. Anytime. Don't worry if you're running late. I got you. So we're just taking a look at a little bit of Photoshop, and I had started to, and asked if anyone had any like questions or things you're wondering about. So if you have anything you're wondering about, feel free to like holler, because otherwise we kind of don't have any agenda. We're just kind of taking a look at stuff, getting more comfortable with it, and kind of talking about it. And if anyone has any questions, and we can totally go that route.
Okay.
Let's see. So Pixlr, again, is totally free. It is web-based. I think personally it's one of my favorite comparable programs to Photoshop. And so I'm going to pull up that same dark image. And I have shown this one in this a class before, but it's just a good example of the levels and the
Can I
curves.
just ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Why do you like this better than Photoshop? What is it about it that's better?
Well, I'll tell you this, I don't necessarily like it better than Photoshop. I use Photoshop. I
Oh,
do.
all right.
But I'm teaching through Pixlr because it's free. And not
Okay.
everybody has Photoshop.
That's okay.
Totally. Yeah. So like typically I do use Photoshop, and I am, you know, fortunate in my work situation that I get it as a work perk. So I don't have to pay for it, which helps. But it is, you can get it, I think it's $10 a month for Photoshop. They do a subscription now. Where there's pros and cons to that. The pro is you always get the updated version. You always have the best, and you get cloud storage for all your Photoshop files, which are really big files, so it doesn't sit on your computer. That's helpful. But the thing I don't like about it is you're always paying $10 a month. You don't just get to own it. Whereas old Photoshop versions, like you owned it. I bought it, I owned it. And then the new one came out, you could choose to buy it and own that. Whereas it's like, so it's like pros and cons, but it's kind of like you're continually paying for it. $10 a month. So, you know, it depends if, you know, how much. I think if you're really getting into photography, it's worth it because you get Photoshop and you get Lightroom for the $10 a month. And Photoshop and Lightroom work together. If anyone's ever interested on a Lightroom class, I can do that too. It's, you know, has its own thing to its own interface and learning curve for sure. But, you know, if anyone's ever interested in that or more specific Photoshop classes too, let me know, because I can absolutely do things like that. My thought process is not everybody has Photoshop. So I thought it would be cool to learn something that was free that you could use no matter where you are. So looking at this photo too, and again, I've
Can
shown.
I ask you a quick question?
Please.
What is the difference between Photoshop and Photoshop Elements?
Great question. Photoshop Elements is like a light version of Photoshop. It's like Photoshop Express sort of a thing. I think the idea behind it is, I mean, Photoshop is such a massive program that you can even get into video and animation and all sorts of things actually just within Photoshop itself. So I think they came out with Elements as a way to sort of simplify, to be honest with you. And I've played a little bit around with Photoshop Elements, but I think because I was taught Photoshop, straight Photoshop from the beginning, Elements frustrated me. But I think if you learn Elements, just straight Elements, you're good. I think it's a great program. Me personally, I was introduced to Photoshop and I think worked in that for maybe a year or two. And then someone was like, here, try Elements. And I was like, it's not doing what I want it to do, sort of a thing. So that's where that came from. But great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and my mother-in-law, she uses it. She loves it. I think the interface is very accessible to use, which is nice. Have
Jennifer,
you ever tried? Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, on the Adobe products, are they supporting the new platforms that Mac is updating everybody to?
Yes.
The
Absolutely.
rental Photoshop is supported by, if you're on Catalina on the Mac?
Yeah.
They are. So
Yep.
they're making you actually rent it, and you can't run, like I have the old CS6, and I can't run it
Correct.
on the Catalina.
Correct.
And now Big Sur is the next update. So I was wondering if that's supported also.
So that's what's happening. Here's kind of my mindset on that is Mac and Apple dominate the like graphic arts design world, right? I mean, I'm
Right.
sure there's plenty of people that use PCs and whatnot, but because of that, Photoshop and Adobe programs are always going to work and be compatible with the new versions on your computer, and the cloud version, like the subscription version of Photoshop and Adobe products. So it'll always work.
Okay.
But yeah, the older ones won't. Yeah, I ran into that same issue too. I was forced to, and for a while I did pay for the Photoshop, and then I got my new job, and they were like,
They got you the program. Yeah.
they got the program. And I'm looking into this actually for Element 3 because I mentioned this previously. We were able to buy licenses for all our students, high school students, for a full year for $5.
Oh, wow. Great.
So
deal.
I'm reached out and I'm looking for a contact of someone I can talk to and tell them about Element 3. Because my thought is, if they can do that for high school, like why couldn't they do that for something like Element 3 and talk to them about, what we're doing? And so that's kind of on my list, is I'm seeing who could I reach out to about that. It's hard getting in contact with people sometimes, and figuring out some of that stuff. But I'm like, man, I mean, that's in our budget to do, we could absolutely do that. So I think that would be super fun, and see if we could get Photoshop, because then we could do classes where we work through Photoshop together, where maybe
Right.
you've got it open and then you've got me on your screen small or something, and we can kind of dive in together, which would be super fun. So that is on my to-do, and I'm looking into that, and I will communicate. I'll make sure, like, everyone who's registered for a photography class, I'll email you, so
Okay.
you're aware of anything like that happens. Even if you don't come to every class, if you've ever been on one of my photo classes, I'll make sure you get that information.
Great, Jennifer. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, cross your fingers. That would be
Okay.
super cool if we could do that. Just out of curiosity, who's actually used Photoshop?
I have.
You've used it?
I have, but it was a long time ago.
Long time ago. Okay.
I have Elements.
Elements. Got it. Okay. Cool. Just curious. Has anyone messed with Pixlr at all since any of our classes?
No, that's new to me.
New. Okay.
No, but it's fun. Going
Yeah,
through
it's
it with you, it is. It's nice. There's nice features on it.
There is, totally. And that's the thing I like about it, again, that I can't believe that they offer what they do for free. I'm
Mhm.
impressed with the interface, that it's web-based and it does what it does for free. I think
Mhm.
that's why I like it. I'm like, that's nice, because a lot of stuff, it's hard to find a truly free thing that allows you to do a lot.
Right,
For
and it
sure.
worked, right?
Yes. Yeah. So again, and true, this is true with Photoshop. And if you're like, oh, Jen, I'd rather you go back into Photoshop and work in there, I can show you in Photoshop too.
Mhm.
It's kind of whatever the preference is. If you'd rather see the Photoshop interface and start to get comfortable with that, because you're like, yes, I would love to start to get into Photoshop, we can do that too. Or I can schedule a specific class for Photoshop, either way.
Great.
So I'll just kind of, again, and this is review for some of you guys, I know, but I'll tell you, it took me a while to get some of this stuff when I was learning in college. Took me a few runs to just get used to kind of the process and procedure. And again, this is what I always do when I begin. This is where I start. I always pull in my photo and I either look at curves or levels. I always start there. No matter if I took it on my phone and I pull it in, no matter if I took it on my fancy DSLR camera and was really focusing on my settings, it doesn't matter. I always begin here. And again, you can choose curves, which is more specific and fine tuning, or levels, which is a little bit more general and easier to start with. I think for like my first like few years of editing photos, I stayed away from curves. I was like scared of curves just because I was so scared I was gonna screw it up, and I didn't really understand it either, I think is what it was. It was kind of confusing to me. So levels always felt comfy and safe to me. So I always played levels. And then finally I was like, you know what, we're gonna figure out curves. And so now that I figured out curves, I feel better. And I actually now typically go into curves more than I do levels. So it just happens that way. But they do the same thing, okay? They do the same thing. So there's just 2 different ways to do the same thing. And in Photoshop, there's like 50 different ways to do the same thing sometimes. So there's a lot. But again, with the levels, what we're looking at, you can see this is similar to what I showed you on Photoshop. It's just not as fancy looking. It's a little bit simplified. So, but again, this part where it rises and this part where it falls is like the information of my photo, meaning the lights, the mediums, and the darks, the exposure, essentially, of all the things that were combined to make the picture. So I've got the dark slider, my black slider, I've got a medium gray slider, and I've got a white slider. So I start by taking the dark slider and moving it to where the information starts to rise. And again, you can see the same thing happened here as it did in Photoshop, same deal. And then over here, I move this to the left where the information starts to rise. Same deal as what happened in Photoshop happens here. Now, one thing I didn't mention in Photoshop was this gray slider. I didn't really talk about this guy. Like, what do you do with it? The gray slider is like your little adjustment, your fine tuning. Because of course, like editing photos is such like an individual practice. I feel like just like making art, like we all have our own aesthetic of what we think looks good, right? And it might not be the exact same as someone next to us. Like that's just part of it. So with that comes experimentation, I think. So that's where this slider comes in, is you can play with it and it's going to fine tune. So of course you can be dramatic, like, you know, pull it really far. But usually it's just a little nudge maybe, or maybe it just stays the same. But that gray slider is just kind of fine tuning that exposure and making sure it looks good. Now, here's one thing that I do like about Pixlr that I think Photoshop could do, is they have this button where you can compare it, your before and after, and you just click it. And I love it. I'm like, why doesn't Photoshop have one right there? Just a little button. Maybe they have something that I need to investigate, but I just think this button's so neat. So you can see your edits and how they're looking. So these colors, you might be like, well, why are there colors there? These colors, you've got your red, your green, and your blue. Okay, red, green, blue are they're like your primary colors on this screen essentially, okay, when you're looking on a computer screen. So you can adjust temperature and hue a little bit in a photo. So like I mentioned when we're looking in Photoshop, and I was showing you those little where you could click and change it, those little plugins, you can warm up a photo, cool down a photo, give it a feel, right? Because sometimes we want to capture a mood in a photo. We want it to show some warmth. We want it to look cool. So that's something we can do with these. And you know what, before I do that, let's zoom in. It's just kind of small. Okay, so adjustment, back to my levels. I didn't save anything, so scooch those back. Okay, there we go. See a little bit better this time. So looking at the red. So if I take the red slider, I can reduce the amount of red, or I can increase it. Okay, so my white slider is increasing it. My black slider is decreasing it. Okay, so I can move this around if I want to give a little bit of warmth, which is really going to play with their skin because that's where the most red tones are in this particular photo. And then if you look at the green, it's going to play mostly with the leaf because that's where most of the greens are, but you will see a full shift like in the full photo. And again, there's before, There's after. So these are just little adjustments you can make. You can slide these around. I usually don't go too crazy, but you can make some little adjustments to change the coloring just slightly. And again, there's my before, there's my after, right? A lot more depth for sure. So again, that's levels. Let me show you curves really quickly. And again, this is the same in Photoshop. This is what curves looks like. And this is why I stayed away from it, because I was like, what? What is this doing? And I will tell you, Photoshop has information inside of their curves, and Pixlr does not. I'm not sure why. So because of that, I might, if I'm using Pixlr, might actually stick more to my levels than my curves because there's no info here. And I'm like, if there's no info, like I can't see where to place things. So that seems silly to me. But I will show you my general recipe. This is typically what I do. So right here in the top right quadrant, I click on the line right here and I pop it up. Oops. Oh, there we go. Forgot I got double click. So I click and I pop it up. Okay, so this is a pop up. And in the lower left quadrant, I click on the line and I pull it down. That's usually, I do like a loose S. That's usually like my maneuver that I do in curves. It's typically always similar to that. Then, you know, you might need to fine tune this a little bit. Oops. And then I got rid of it. Yeah, the curves feature in here is just a little funky, a little funky. I might stick with levels, to be honest. I think levels, they've got it going on in here, but if you get into Photoshop or Photoshop Elements, then you can play with your curves. So that interface is just so much better in Photoshop. But same deal, you do have the colors, so you can play around with your colors in here too, okay? So cool it, warm it, depending on what you want to do. Okay, so one thing I thought might be fun to show you guys, and it was inspired by a project I did in college where we had to take old photos and we had to repair them. And I thought it's really cool because a lot of families tend to have old photos around. Like I know my dad has a huge collection of like photos from my grandparents and great grandparents, and you know, sometimes those photos and how they were taken, we want to preserve them. So and you can do this by scanning and doing slides, anything, any kind of photo that might have some damage in it that you want to fix. So this one would take a long time, I'll be honest with you, I necessarily have to sit here and do the full thing, but I can just show you a couple little features in Pixlr, and then I can even pull this into Photoshop and show you kind of some things to do in Photoshop. So, you know, I might still take a look at my levels a minute and just take a look, okay, just to see what they look like. These actually look pretty good, which I can tell the photo has some nice darks, it has lights, it's got, you know, the full thing being black and white, but if I want to play around with this a little bit, I could. If I want to give it a little boost, I could. Okay, so we have a couple tools over here to play around with it, and I know some of you guys have kind of seen these tools already, but they take a little while to get used to. So the first is the heal tool, and in Photoshop, I believe it's called the spot heal, but it's also still a little band-aid. And you can click on this little band-aid. See, I guess I do have some ads popping up, huh? So first I start with this little band-aid, and let's say you have, let's go up in this top corner. Oops. It's harder to navigate this than Photoshop too with the zooming, kind of funny. Okay, so if you look in this corner, like this area where there's like a tear, maybe a crease, the photo got wrinkled, something like that happened, water damage, like anything that could happen. So the spot heal tool, of course, you can play around with your size. make it bigger or smaller, but this is usually where I start. And the spot heal, you just click, and actually see that didn't do a super great job. So I'm gonna actually undo that one and maybe try a smaller spot. There we go, that looks good. Oops, not that one. So sometimes you gotta try it, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So spot heal is good for little itty bitty things. So some of these like little itty bitty wrinkles in the back, I can get rid of those by just clicking. And notice how it just kind of blends the background a little bit, makes it look a little bit nicer, okay? So that's the spot heal. Now for these bigger areas, I can use the clone tool, clone stamp tool. This is like the magical tool. This is the tool you can use to remove an entire person from a photograph. It's a tool you could use to like help add someone back in and like blend them. My mother-in-law took a Photoshop class one time, and she like made someone's arm look like it was like super long and going around like 5 people with this tool, you know, like this is that tool that you can do a ton with. It's versatile. You can use it for so many different things. And I was introduced to it with this method. This is how I learned about this tool, was to fix things, to repair things that are damaged. And then I learned how to use it with some of the other ways I just described to you. So in Photoshop, the interface is just a little bit different. Here you've got a mode to paint and a mode, it's called source. Source means take a picture of. So where this rip is, I just want it to be gray like the background, right? I just want that rip to like not be there. I just want it gray. So my source would be, I would come down here, there's a crosshair, and I would click with my mouse, and I basically took a picture of the gray behind it, of the gray right there. So then when I click over here, it puts the gray there for me. And I can click here again, put the gray there for me. So the thing about clone stamp though, is I took a picture of light gray. If I come over here and try to click, look at it's light gray. It doesn't match anymore. So what I have to keep doing is I have to keep going back to source, and I have to keep taking pictures and applying. Taking pictures, applying. It's the silliest thing, you guys. You get so fast at it. It's the first time I learned about this, I was like, oh my goodness, like fixing a damaged picture could take forever. And then you get in this little routine where you get comfortable going back and forth. And Photoshop is nice because you just hold Option down on your keyboard and click, instead of having a separate button for source and paint. The same kind of thing right down here where these little dots are, I can source over here and then paint to get rid of that. Let's take a look at like some of the clothing right here where there's a big rip going through the clothing. And I'll be honest with you, some of this stuff can take a little while to actually fix. And this is where maybe where you'd want to make your brush like a little bit smaller. Okay. And then again, I can source, take a picture, and then I can start filling in. And then I go back to source, and I can start take a picture. I can start filling that in. Okay. And then, you know, I do start messing around with the brushes. I really think it's helpful to like zoom in. Even if it gets pixely, it's super duper helpful to zoom. And you're like, sometimes you're like, what am I even looking at? And it doesn't even matter, you know, you're just, because you're focusing on looking at where you're fixing things. So again, you can click source and then paint right over top. And then I'll go back to source and paint right over top. And then I just keep going back and forth. And again, I'm able to fix that damage. And then when I zoom out, there we go. Okay, so you can start to see, right, how it's being fixed. And some of these older photographs, I'll tell you, they don't always get perfect unless you really spend a long time. But I think, man, you know, they can turn out a lot better than they were for sure by by doing some of this. And then some other tools I'll use, because older photos sometimes, you know, the lightness and darkness might need to play around with, but it's hard to do the whole photo at once because it's not all matched up. Because this photo to me seems like it kind of has a dark streak through here, but then it's kind of like lighter and washed out up at the top. So you can play around with like the dodge and burn tools, and I've talked about these as well before. And dodge and burn is just a way to lighten or darken areas of an image to either bring out the dark areas or dim the light areas. So you can play around with these. You can mess around with your brush. I'll change the softness of the brush. You can change the strength so it's not super heavy. And let's say I want to lighten an area. So I can start to click into certain areas and lighten certain areas, or likewise, I can also like darken certain areas to just help bring out some of the contrast. So sometimes playing around with the dodge and burn, and you know, maybe you couldn't see that super well, but it's very subtle. But you know, again, it makes a big difference doing things like that as well.
Jennifer? I mean, Jen,
Yeah.
yes.
Jennifer or Jen, either one.
I noticed that it's still in a locked mode for a background, and you're able to do it and to make these changes. So you don't have to like create a new layer when it's locked or anything.
No, nope, I don't have to. I can just edit these types of changes directly onto the photograph. Good question.
Are there some that you need to unlock for?
Typically the basic edits, no. The only time for photography I actually start bringing in other layers is when I start kind of making my own filters and things like that. You know, and I showed a little bit of that before, and I can show you guys that again, but you know, maybe bringing in a gradient underneath and then lowering the opacity of my photo so that gradient pops through. But a lot of times when I'm working just with photography and I'm not doing any other art thing to it, I often work in one layer with photography. It's usually the digital arts, graphic design, that type of stuff. You're going to start getting into more layers. And I know this is photography class, but if anyone is ever like, ooh, graphic design, I would like to learn how to use Photoshop as a graphic design tool. Like I can show you that too. So I've learned Photoshop in several capacities. I know how to use it as a photo editing tool. I know how to make digital art and graphic design pieces on it. And I know how to animate and make videos with it. So I've taken several classes that have shown me how to do kind of an array of things with Photoshop. So again, this being photography, just because it's photography doesn't mean we can't branch out. Like you know, we talked about things like iMovie and editing and different things. So anything that piques your interest, please let me know. Well, let's see. Does anyone have any questions about Pixlr, things you're wondering specifically? Otherwise, I can show you a little bit more into Photoshop as well with some of these tools. So I know some of you have elements and have played with different things.
Can you bring a JPEG in on Pixlr, Jennifer, and drop out the background?
Yes, you can. So you can, yeah. So if you want to like get rid of a background and put in a different background.
Yes, or put it on a background I've designed.
Yeah, so like essentially cut something out.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, you can do all that on Pixlr.
Okay.
Would you like to see that?
Yes, please.
Sure, that's a great question. Okay, so you can, and here's the cool thing about Pixlr. Pixlr will allow you to save like a Photoshop file, essentially, a PSD file. I was thinking it's not PSD. It is a PSD file. What that means is a Photoshop file. You can save Pixlr files with all your layers and then open it up into Photoshop, and Photoshop will recognize your layers.
Oh, that's great.
So that is another really neat thing. And you can save all these different file types in Pixlr. So that is neat. JPEGs, PNGs with the If you want to see through transparent background, that would be your PNG. Photoshop does GIF or GIF files where they're little movie pictures moving. If you want to do a little series of pictures, I can show you how to do that sometime if you want. That, you
That would be
all
fun.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be really fun.
Cool. Yeah, all that stuff. I don't know, maybe I'll even just start doing the little projects I've learned along the way, because I'll tell you, the little projects I've learned in Photoshop, that's what helped me learn how to do it and use it as my own tool. So I can even give you guys little assignments if you want, little practice things to do, because that will help you learn it for real. Okay, so let's take a look at cutting things out. Like maybe we want to cut these ladies out and put them on the beach. That'd be kind of funny.
Yeah, they're laying down. They might as well be on the sand.
Might as well. And honestly, a digital collage, building a digital collage with just existing imagery, oh, what a great way to learn Photoshop. Cutting things out, selecting, erasing, it's all so good. You'll learn a ton. So yeah, just making something silly. Doesn't have to even be serious, you know, it's great. And you'll get to laugh too, so that's fun. So cutting out, you've got some different options. Photoshop has more, of course, but we've got the lasso, and then you have like a cutout mask selection here. So I'll be honest, I've done the lasso way more, and I haven't played with the masking in Pixlr a ton compared to like Photoshop. So I'm not exactly sure all of the features, but I'm sure I could mess around with them. They're pretty similar, and you can hover up here and they'll tell you what they do. But let's just start simple. Masks are a way that you can bring in other imagery without technically having to like cut things out, is what a mask is. So for example, if I did want to put these ladies on the beach, I could mask the ladies and then bring in a beach background and bring it in with the mask. So that's one way to do it, but I'll tell you, that's a more advanced way, and I didn't learn that way first. Okay, so I'm gonna show you the way I learned first, and I'm like going all over the place. But I tell you, I've like had so many like Photoshop in different classes over the years now. It's been kind of funny, which is again why I know how to use it in the different ways. But up here, the lasso tool, you can freehand select, which I'll tell you doesn't always look so hot. Yeah, I like the magnetic. Personally, I go magnetic. Magnetic is nice because it kind of helps you hug the lines. It determines by what's light and dark. It kind of like looks between the light and dark and kind of makes the line for you, but you have to keep clicking. So what I do if I want to cut out these ladies, and I'll tell you, I have spent like hours selecting before. Selecting can be a very tedious process. So I'm not going to be super tedious right now because, you know, you guys don't need to watch me sit and select forever. That's not super exciting. But I do want to tell you, if you're doing it on your own time, it's okay if you're sitting there selecting for a while. It does take some time. So basically what you're doing, oops, don't do what I just did. I'm not even gonna tell you what I just did. I don't want to confuse you. Okay, so you're gonna start by clicking, and then you're gonna click and you're tracing. And I'm click, click, trace, click, trace, click, trace, click is what I'm doing. So I am following the edges as I go, but I'm clicking every couple times, because every time I click, it like places a little spot for me. It's like hooking the magnet to the edge for me. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so we call these the little marching ants when they're moving, the little marching ants, the selection lines. Right now they're still. They're still because I'm still in the selecting process. But once I'm done selecting, they're going to start like moving. So a lot of people call them marching ants, if you've ever heard that before. I didn't just come up with it. Okay, and just for the sake of time, I'm just gonna go ahead and select this whole little bottom. Not gonna make that look super nice. Okay, and then you have to go back to the start and double click. Now, do you guys see how they're marching around?
Yes.
Okay, so now a couple things can happen. They're kind of like, the ladies are like safe right now. I can, if I want to erase, oops, sorry, actually the ladies aren't safe right now. I can erase the ladies because they're selected, but my background, I can't do anything to it because it's not selected. So if I go to select and go invert selection, now, if I take my eraser, I can't erase the ladies, but I can erase the background. So I can just take, you know, take a huge old brush here. And there we go. Erase my ladies. So now I could bring in a different background or do something else. Right? It gives it that cut and paste look. And again, if I fine-tuned that selection, I can make it look flawless. And I will tell you, selecting in Photoshop has some beautiful features. In fact, I can show you that in a minute while we have, so we've got a few minutes left here. So let me pull up Photoshop a minute. And I'll just show you kind of the selection in Photoshop, because you can fine-tune your selection and do a couple neat things that you can't do in Pixlr. Photoshop just takes a minute to open here. Okay.
I have to say though that Pixlr looked easier than doing it in the Photoshop Elements.
Really? Pixlr looked easier?
Yeah, because I've done it before and I felt like that looked a whole lot easier.
Okay, well that's good to know. I'm just gonna open up this photo back up. Okay, so now I'm in Photoshop. And can you kind of see how the interface is similar-ish? I know Photoshop definitely looks different, but it's similar-ish at least. So over here are selection tools. So here's the lasso in Photoshop. All up here, you've got, if you hold this down, you've got your different. So here's the magnetic one. So I still have a magnetic lasso over in Photoshop. So I'm going to use the magnetic one here just like I did the other one. So let's say I'm just selecting, you know, the dad's arm around the kid. So maybe there's a, I don't know, I could put a different background. I know there's not much background, but that's okay. So again, I'm going to start by clicking, and notice how the, oops, sorry, moved. Notice how this line looks different, right? You can see all your clicking points because you can actually move them later. If you click too far out after you're done, you can scooch it in if you want to. So that's why they look like squares. They're movable. So you can see if you're like, after you've been doing this for a little bit, if you made a mistake, that would be pretty frustrating. This way you can adjust. So that's what those little guys are for. Okay, and then I'm just gonna go around the outside and click. Okay, so here's my selection. So here is why Photoshop is beautiful. There is a little bar up here where it says select and mask. If I click select and mask, notice how a red overlay just went over top. So over here on the side, I have different views. I could make this just the marching ants. I could have a red overlay. I could have it kind of blacked out, whited, have a whitewash on it, could have it just black and white, could have it look like an empty layer. I can do whatever I want. Overlay is my favorite though, because you can see. So here's what I can do with overlay. If you look at that, the red line between the sleeve and the background, it's harsh. It looks cut out. So if we're gonna like take someone out of a picture or put someone over top of a new background and we want it to look natural, we don't want it to look like we took scissors and cut them out, right? So there's some things we can do over here. Smooth, feather, contrast. I can shift my edge. Feathers usually, I like to give it a little feather. So what that does is it softens the edge between the line that you make. It naturally softens it. Sometimes I might give it a little smooth. Edge detection, you can bump out the radius, you can even do smart radius, which that's when Photoshop tries to detect it itself. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. But there's some different things you can do there. And then you can click OK. And then it makes your adjustments for you. So that's why I like Photoshop for selecting, is because you can select and mask and fine tune. And I'm not sure if Elements has that, but I feel like they must have something similar, being an Adobe product. But then same thing here, of course, I can take my eraser tool if I want. Oops, I've got some. And you can do, there's a background eraser tool here. So that's again what this checker is basically clear. It's empty, it's transparent. So if I put something back there, I'll just show you real quick. Okay, I'm just gonna deselect that. So if I go over to my layers palette and I put in an empty layer, let's put it underneath, and you can retitle your layers. I highly recommend it. You can double click and I can, I could call it boy and then background. So if you get layers going, I like to retitle them, and you can do the same in Pixlr. So, and then again, the eye toggles that on and off. Okay, so let's say, I don't know, I'm just gonna do something super duper simple just because we only have a few minutes left. You could certainly put in your own picture, but let's say, I don't know, I just want a gradient in the background or something. You can see. Okay, and then I can bring this back in. Now you can see I didn't fully erase that super well because I was going super duper fast, but oops. Need to be on the right layer. You'll learn that. You'll learn, oops, I did the wrong thing. I'm not on the right layer. That's like happens all the time. Got to be on the right layer. Make sure the layer that's selected is the layer you're editing. But like I didn't totally erase everything, so I can come back in here and just kind of clean that up. Get the down here. Okay. So again, it's not that I would actually necessarily do this for a photo, but it's the idea of erasing a portion and putting something else in, and again, you can do that in Photoshop, you can do that in Pixlr. So yeah, but there's a lot to explore. And just to show you in Photoshop, like right here, you still have like the dodge and burn tool right here. So to make things light and dark, like pretty much everything you can do in Pixlr, you can do in Photoshop, but then Photoshop can do like a million other things as well, basically. Does anyone have any like last minute questions or things you're wondering about? I mean, I kind of know it's like a little bit of everything today, to just, kind of take a look at some things, but I'll certainly do some more in-depth Photoshop classes for those of you who are wanting to learn more specific Photoshop. And we can also take a look, kind of like I said, at doing like little assignments and things like that, where we can even have a class where like I show you how to do something and then give you time during the class to do it. And then that way I'm here to like answer questions. It'll be like a high school class all over again, which might be kind of fun. But sometimes that's a good way to learn. Like when you have